The morning mist clung to Manila Bay like a shroud over the dying Spanish Empire. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he gazed through the pre-dawn darkness. It was May 1st, 1898, and the fate of two empires would be decided before the sun reached its zenith. Dewey had sailed halfway across the world for this moment. The Spanish-American War had erupted just weeks earlier, ignited by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. While America's attention focused on Cuba, Dewey had received secret orders from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Destroy the Spanish fleet in the Philippines and cripple Spain's Pacific Empire. The Commodore's Asiatic squadron consisted of 4 cruisers and 2 gunboats. I'd say modest force by European standards, but these were modern steel warships. With rifled guns and experienced crews, his flagship, the Olympia, bristled with 8-inch and 5-inch guns, her white hull gleaming despite months at sea. Alongside her sailed the Baltimore, Boston, and Raleigh, each a testament to America's growing industrial might. As reported in contemporary accounts from the New York Herald, Dewey had spent months preparing for this confrontation, gathering intelligence on Spanish defenses and drilling his crews to perfection. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montoyo y Pasorin, consisted of 7 vessels anchored in Cavite's shallow water Zolder ships with obsolete guns and untrained Filipino crews pressed into service. Dewey's intelligence had revealed the Spanish strategy. Admiral Montoyo had positioned his fleet near the Cavite arsenal, hoping the Americans would hesitate to fire near populated areas. The Spanish commander believed his shore batteries and the treacherous waters of Manila Bay would give him the advantage he desperately needed. But Commodore Dewey had no intention of hesitation. He understood that naval warfare in the age of steel and steam demanded bold action and precise execution. Ships had coal enough for battle, his magazines were full, and his men were ready. The previous evening, he had gathered his captains aboard the Olympia for final preparations. "Gentlemen," Dewey had told them, his voice steady as granite, "we have sailed 7,000 miles to face the enemy. Tomorrow we will either establish American supremacy in the Pacific or join the depths of Manila Bay. I have no doubt which. Fate awaits us." Captain Charles Gridley of the Olympia had nodded grimly. The veteran officer knew that their success would depend not just on superior firepower, but on the months of training that had transformed American sailors into a precision fighting force. Unlike their Spanish counterparts, who relied on outdated tactics and poorly maintained equipment, the American crews had practiced their gunnery until they could load and fire in their sleep as dawn approached. Dewey ordered his squadron into battle formation. The Olympia led the line, followed by the Baltimore, Raleigh, Petrel, Concord, and Boston. Behind them came the revenue cutter Hugh McCulloch, carrying war correspondents who would witness history in the making. The Commodore checked his pocket watch. 5:15 in the morning. In the distance, the Spanish fleet waited like sitting ducks, their crews undoubtedly saying their prayers and preparing for what many believed would be their final battle. The American squadron advanced through the pre-dawn darkness with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Commodore Dewey had chosen to approach from the north, taking advantage of the deep channel that would allow his heavier ships to maneuver freely while keeping the Spanish fleet trapped in the shallows near shade. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the tropical haze, the imposing silhouette of Corregidor Island emerged from the gloom. Spanish shore batteries dotted the rocky fortress, their ancient cannons trained on the narrow entrance to Manila Bay. Admiral Montoyo had counted on these guns to decimate the American fleet as they squeezed through the bottleneck. But Dewey had studied every chart and intelligence report available. The USS Olympia's engines throbbed with power as she led the column into the bay at 8 knots. Behind her, the other American warships maintained perfect formation, their crews at battle, stations and guns loaded with high explosive shells. The morning air was thick with tension and coal smoke as hundreds of American sailors prepared to make history. At 5:40 in the morning, orange flames erupted from Corregidor's batteries. The Spanish gunners, nervous and poorly trained, had opened fire at maximum range, a tactical blunder that revealed their positions while wasting precious ammunition. The shells splashed harmlessly into the water, some falling short by over a mile. Dewey remained calm on the Olympia's bridge, his blue eyes fixed on the Spanish fleet ahead. He had no intention of wasting shells on stone fortifications when the real prize lay anchored in Cavite's harbor. "Steady as she goes," he commanded, his voice carrying easily over the thunder of distant guns. The Spanish shore. Batteries continued their ineffective bombardment as the American squadron steamed deeper into the bay, according to military historians, who later analyzed the battle. The Spanish gunners were hampered by obsolete equipment and inadequate training. Their black powder charges produced spectacular flames and smoke, but little accuracy, while their cannon were too old and poorly maintained to pose a serious threat to modern warships. As the American fleet cleared the entrance and entered the main body of Manila Bay, the full scope of their target became visible. Admiral Montoya's squadron lay anchored in a rough line near the Cavite Naval Arsenal, their hulls dark against the morning sky. The flagship Reina Cristina, a protected cruiser of nearly 3,000 tons, occupied the center of the Spanish line, flanked by the older vessels Castilla, Don Antonio de Ulloa, Don Juan de Austria, Isla de Luzon, Isla de Cuba, and the gunboat marks Del. Dewey studied the enemy formation through his binoculars, noting how the Spanish admiral had positioned his ships in shallow water where American vessels couldn't follow if damaged. It was a defensive strategy born of desperation, revealing Montoya's awareness of his fleet's inferior firepower and training. The distance between the two fleets closed steadily as the Olympia maintained her course toward Cavite. Spanish crews scrambled to their guns while their officers shouted orders in the chaos of impending battle. Many of the Spanish sailors were Filipino conscripts with minimal training, pressed into service to fill the depleted ranks of Spain's colonial navy at 6:15, with the range down to 5,500 yards. Admiral Montoya finally ordered his fleet to open fire. The Spanish guns roared to life, sending shells screaming toward the approaching American squadron. Most fell short, but a few came uncomfortably close to the Olympia's hull, sending geysers of seawater cascading over her forward deck. Dewey watched the enemy salvos with professional interest, counting the muzzle flashes and calculating the Spanish rate of fire. His own gunners stood ready, their modern breech-loading rifles loaded and trained on the enemy fleet. The Commodore knew that accuracy would prove more valuable than enthusiasm in the coming engagement. Signaled the fleet, Dewey ordered his communications. "Officer, prepare to engage the enemy." The distance between the opposing fleets continued to shrink as Commodore Dewey maintained his steady approach. Spanish shells whistled overhead with increasing frequency, but the enemy gunners remained, hampered by their obsolete equipment and nervous crews. The Olympia's deck trembled with each near miss, sending sprays of seawater across her forward guns. At 5,000 yards, Dewey turned to Captain Charles Gridley, his flagship commander and trusted friend. The two men had served together for years, forging a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dedication to naval excellence. Gridley stood ready at his battle station, his experienced eyes fixed on the Spanish fleet. "The range is closing nicely, Charles," Dewey observed, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "I believe our gunners are eager to demonstrate their marksmanship." Spanish shells continued to fall around the American squadron, but Dewey refused to be hurried into premature action. He understood that his modern 8-inch and 5-inch guns could deliver devastating accuracy at ranges where the enemy's older weapons became increasingly ineffective. Every yard they closed would increase his advantage while diminishing Spanish hopes of survival at 4,000 yards. The Commodore made his decision. Turning to Captain Gridley with the composure that would make him legendary, Dewey spoke. The words that would echo through American naval history, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The USS Olympia's forward 8-inch turret swiveled toward the Spanish flagship Reina Cristina and erupted in flame and thunder. The massive shell screamed across Manila Bay, striking the enemy cruiser near her waterline with devastating effect. Steel fragments and wooden splinters filled the air as the Spanish flagship shuddered under the impact. Behind the Olympia, The rest of the American squadron opened fire in a carefully coordinated broadside. The USS Baltimore's 6-inch guns targeted the Spanish cruiser Castilla, while the Boston and Raleigh concentrated their fire on the smaller enemy vessels. The morning air filled with the deafening roar of naval artillery as American gunners demonstrated the superior training and equipment that would decide the battle's outcome, as documented in contemporary war correspondence published in Harper's Weekly. The contrast between American and Spanish gunnery became immediately apparent. While Spanish shells continued to splash harmlessly around the American ships, nearly every American salvo found its mark. The Reina Cristina, already damaged by the Olympia's opening shot, began listing to port as additional shells pierced her. HULL, below the Wainer, standing on his flagship's bridge, watched in horror as his carefully planned defensive position crumbled under American firepower. The Spanish fleet had been designed to fight colonial rebellions and conduct patrol duties, not engage modern warships manned by professional crews. His sailors, many of them pressed Filipino conscripts, began abandoning their posts as American. Shells systematically destroyed their guns and equipment. The USS Olympia continued to lead the American line, her guns firing with mechanical precision every 30 seconds. Captain Gridley had trained his crew to perfection during the long voyage from Hong Kong, and their expertise showed in every perfectly timed salvo. The flagship's 8-inch guns could penetrate Spanish armor at this range, while her rapid-firing 5-inch weapons swept enemy decks clear of defenders. Dewey ordered his squadron to maintain course parallel to the Spanish line, presenting their broadsides while avoiding the shallow water where damaged ships might run aground. This classic naval tactic allowed each American vessel to engage multiple Spanish targets while minimizing their exposure to return fire. The Spanish cruiser Don Antonio de Ulloa, caught between the concentrated fire of 2 American ships, began settling by the stern as water poured through her shattered hull. Her crew attempted to return fire, but their antiquated guns could barely reach the American vessels. And those shells that did arrive lacked the power to penetrate modern steel armor. Within minutes of opening fire, the American squadron had established complete tactical superiority. Spanish resistance, while brave, proved utterly inadequate against the concentrated firepower of Dewey's modern warships. The Spanish fleet disintegrated under the relentless American bombardment. Admiral Montoya's Reina Cristina struck repeatedly. By 8-inch shells from the Olympia began taking on water faster than her damage control parties could manage. Smoke poured from her engine room where a lucky American shot had severed a steam line, scalding several Spanish sailors and reducing the ship's speed to a crawl. On the Spanish cruiser Castilla, chaos reigned as American shells systematically destroyed her gun positions. The older vessel, already in poor condition before the battle, simply could not withstand the punishment being delivered by the USS Baltimore's modern artillery. Her wooden upper works caught fire, sending clouds of acrid smoke across the water that mixed with the cordite fumes from hundreds of shell bursts. Commodore Dewey maintained his methodical approach, sailing his squadron in a wide oval pattern that kept his ships in constant motion while presenting fresh broadsides to the trapped Spanish fleet. This tactic, learned from decades of naval study and perfected through endless drills, has prevented the enemy from concentrating their fire on any single American vessel while maximizing the destructive power of his own guns. The USS Boston engaged the Spanish gunboat Marques del Duero with her 5-inch rapid-fire weapons, the smaller enemy vessel disappearing behind a curtain of shell splashes and explosions. Spanish sailors leaped into Manila Bay's warm waters as their ship began settling beneath them, her thin hull no match for modern naval ordnance, according to eyewitness accounts later published in McClure's magazine. The Spanish crews fought with desperate courage despite their hopeless situation. Officers remained at their posts even as shells destroyed the structures around them, while ordinary sailors continued serving their guns until the weapons themselves were blown to pieces. But courage alone could not overcome the technological and training advantages that the American squadron possessed. Admiral Montoya, realizing that his flagship was doomed, made the painful decision to transfer his command to the smaller cruiser Isla de Cuba. Spanish sailors rowed frantically through shell-torn waters as American guns continued their deadly work, transforming Manila Bay into a hellscape of smoke, flame, and twisted metal. The Reina Cristina made one final heroic attempt to close with the American line. Her surviving officers ordered full speed ahead, hoping to ram the USS Olympia or at least deliver a devastating broadside at point-blank range. But the Spanish cruiser's engines had been damaged by American shells, and she could barely make headway against the current. Dewey watched this gallant but doomed charge with professional admiration. "Signal the Baltimore to concentrate fire on the enemy flagship," he ordered. "We must not allow her to close the distance." The USS Baltimore's gunners responded with deadly precision, their shells bracketing the approaching Spanish cruiser with mathematical accuracy. The Reina Cristina shuddered under multiple impacts, her forward turret disappearing in a blast of smoke and flame as an 8-inch shell penetrated her armor and detonated inside the gunhouse, with her steering destroyed. And fires raging throughout her superstructure, the Spanish flagship finally came to a stop, listing heavily to starboard. Her surviving crew members jumped overboard rather than face the inferno consuming their ship, while Admiral Montoya watched his naval career end in defeat and devastation. The other Spanish vessels fared no better under the American onslaught. The Don Juan de Austria, already ancient when the battle began, simply broke apart under concentrated shell fire, her rusty hull plates no match for modern high-explosive rounds. The Isla de Luzon, attempting to retreat toward the shallow water near Cavite, ran aground on a sandbar where American gunners used her for target practice. By 7:30 in the morning, less than 2 hours after the first shots were fired, the Spanish fleet had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Burning wrecks dotted Manila Bay, while survivors clung to debris or swam desperately toward shore. At 7:35 in the morning, Commodore Dewey made a decision that would puzzle naval historians for decades to come. Despite his complete tactical victory and the Spanish fleet's obvious destruction, he ordered his squadron to withdraw to the center of Manila Bay for breakfast and ammunition resupply. "Signal all ships to cease firing and withdraw to anchorage," Dewey commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had just changed the course of history. "We shall assess our damages and prepare for the next phase of operations." Captain Gridley looked puzzled as he relayed the order. The Spanish fleet lay in ruins, their guns silenced and their ships sinking or burning. Why withdraw when complete victory lay within their grasp? But Dewey had reasons beyond the obvious tactical situation that concerned him. The Commodore had received reports of casualties and damage that needed immediate attention. More importantly, he wanted to inventory his ammunition supply before resuming combat operations. Naval warfare in the Age of Steel required careful logistics planning, and Dewey understood that running short of shells in enemy waters could prove disastrous. As the American squadron steamed away from the devastated Spanish anchorage, control parties reported their findings to the flagship. Remarkably, not a single American sailor had been killed during the morning's engagement, and only a handful had been wounded by flying splinters. The Spanish gunnery had proven even less effective than Dewey's intelligence reports had suggested. The USS Olympia had suffered minor damage to her superstructure where Spanish shells had grazed her upper works, did nothing that would affect her fighting capability. The Baltimore reported similar superficial damage, while the smaller vessels had emerged completely unscathed. It was a testament to both American ship design and the poor marksmanship of their opponents. While his crews enjoyed a hot breakfast and tended to their equipment, Dewey studied reports from his intelligence officers regarding the Spanish defenses. Ashore, Manila itself remained in Spanish hands, protected by obsolete fortifications and a garrison of dubious loyalty. The Cavite Naval Arsenal, where Spanish survivors were now gathering, still possessed some defensive capability despite the morning's catastrophe. As noted in dispatches later published in the Army and Navy Journal, Dewey faced a strategic dilemma that went beyond simple naval tactics. He had orders to destroy the Spanish fleet, which he had accomplished with stunning efficiency. But he lacked the ground forces necessary to occupy Manila or the Philippines. leaving him in control of the waters but unable to claim the territory for the United States. The Commodore used this interlude to send coded messages to Hong Kong, informing the Navy Department of his victory and requesting immediate reinforcement. The Spanish Empire's Pacific presence had been eliminated in a single morning's work. But consolidating American control over the Philippines would require thousands of soldiers and months of additional fighting. Spanish survivors continued to struggle ashore from their sunken and burning vessels, many suffering from wounds and burns inflicted by American shell fire. Dewey, despite being their enemy, ordered his medical officers to prepare to treat wounded Spanish sailors as prisoners of war. Professional courtesy between naval officers demanded such humanitarian gestures, even in the heat of combat. Admiral Montoyo, having transferred his flag to the Ala de Cuba before his flagship's destruction, now found himself commanding the remnants of a fleet that no longer existed. His surviving ships were either sinking, burning, or run aground in the shallows near Cavite. Decades of Spanish naval tradition had died with the morning mist over Manila Bay. At 10:15, having completed his assessment and resupply, Commodore Dewey ordered his squadron to resume combat operations. There were still Spanish positions to be eliminated, and the morning's work was far from complete. The second phase of the Battle of Manila Bay was about to begin. Commodore Dewey's squadron turned to action with the methodical precision that had characterized the morning's operations. The Spanish defenses already shattered by the first assault could offer only token resistance to the renewed American bombardment. But Dewey, ever the thorough professional, intended to complete the destruction of every Spanish military asset in Manila Bay. The surviving Spanish vessels presented pitiful targets as the American ships resumed their positions. The cruiser Isla de Cuba, now serving as Admiral Montoyo's flagship, lay partially submerged near the Cavite arsenal with her guns pointing uselessly skyward. The transport Manila, pressed into naval service despite her civilian origins, burned fiercely at her moorings, while her crew fought desperately to control the spreading flames. "Resume firing," Dewey ordered, his tone as calm as if he were directing a peacetime training exercise. "I want every Spanish vessel rendered completely inoperable before we conclude this engagement." The USS Olympia's Atinch guns roared back to life, their shells slamming into the already crippled Spanish ships with devastating effect. There was no sport in this final phase of the battle, merely the professional completion of a necessary military task. Spanish resistance had collapsed so completely that American gunners could take their time selecting targets and ensuring accurate placement of their shells. The shore batteries at Cavite attempted one final salvo as the American squadron closed range, but their ancient cannons posed no threat to modern warships. The USS Baltimore silenced these positions with a carefully aimed broadside, her shells demolishing gun emplacements that had been considered formidable just hours earlier. Spanish sailors, those who had survived the morning's carnage, began waving white flags and abandoning their posts rather than face certain death from American artillery. Admiral Montoyo, his naval career in ruins and his fleet destroyed, finally acknowledged the inevitable and ordered his remaining forces to surrender. At 11:15 in the morning, exactly 6 hours after entering Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey received word that all Spanish resistance had ceased. The Battle of Manila Bay was over, and American naval supremacy in the Pacific had been established with a thoroughness that surprised even the victors. Contemporary accounts published in the London Times described the scene as one of complete devastation from the Spanish perspective. Every major vessel in their fleet had been sunk, burned, or damaged beyond repair. The Cavite Naval Arsenal, Spain's primary Pacific base, lay in ruins beneath clouds of smoke and steam. Hundreds of Spanish and Filipino sailors had been killed or wounded in the futile defense of their obsolete positions. The American victory was so complete that it bordered on the miraculous. Dewey's squadron had sailed halfway around the world, penetrated heavily defended waters, and destroyed an entire enemy fleet without losing a single man killed in action. It was a triumph of modern technology, superior training, and bold leadership that would reshape the global balance of power. As Spanish survivors were collected and treated by American medical personnel, the full scope of the victory became apparent. The United States Navy had eliminated Spanish influence in the Pacific in a single morning's work, opening the door for American expansion across the ocean that would define the next century of global politics. Admiral Montoyo, brought aboard the USS Olympia as a prisoner of war, maintained his dignity despite the crushing defeat. He had fought bravely with obsolete equipment and inadequately trained crews. But courage alone could not overcome the technological revolution that had transformed naval warfare during the final decades of the 19th century. The battle's conclusion marked more than just a tactical victory. It announced America's arrival as a global naval power capable of projecting force across vast distances and defeating established European empires in their own colonial territories. As the smoke cleared over Manila Bay and the last Spanish resistance crumbled, Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of the USS Olympia and surveyed a scene that would echo through history. The morning of May 1st, 1898, had witnessed more than just a naval battle. It had marked the birth of American imperialism and the beginning of the end. For Spain's colonial empire, the casualty reports told the story in stark numerical terms. The entire Spanish fleet had been destroyed, 11 vessels sunk, burned, or captured, with 167 Spanish sailors killed and 214 wounded. In contrast, Dewey's squadron had suffered 0 fatalities and only 9 wounded, mostly from flying splinters and minor burns. It was perhaps the most one-sided naval victory in modern history. Word of the triumph spread across the Pacific with the speed of steam and telegraph. In Hong Kong, American merchants celebrated in the streets as news arrived of their nation's stunning victory. British naval officers, long skeptical of American naval capabilities, found themselves forced to reassess their estimates of the growing republic's military potential. The strategic implications extended far beyond the Philippines. Spain's Pacific Empire, built over 3 centuries of exploration and conquest, had been eliminated in 6 hours of modern warfare. The treasure fleets that had once carried silver from Acapulco to Manila would never sail again under Spanish colors, and the ancient trade routes that connected Asia to the Americas now lay open to American commerce and influence. President William McKinley, initially reluctant to pursue overseas expansion, found himself confronted with the reality of American victory and the question of what to do with the Philippines. The islands could not be returned to Spain, which had proven incapable of defending them, nor could they be abandoned to potential German or British annexation. The United States, almost by accident, had acquired its first major overseas colony. For the Filipino people, Dewey's victory represented both liberation from Spanish rule and the beginning of a new struggle for independence. Leaders like Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been fighting Spanish colonial authorities for years, initially welcomed the Americans as liberators. They would soon discover that one colonial master had simply replaced another, leading to years of bitter warfare that would cost thousands of lives on both sides. Dewey himself became an instant national hero, his calm demeanor and professional competence embodying American values at their best. Phrase you may fire when ready. Gridley entered the national vocabulary as a symbol of quiet confidence and decisive action. Congress promoted him to admiral, making him the first officer to hold that rank in the modern United States Navy. The technological aspects of the victory were not lost on naval observers worldwide. The Battle of Manila Bay demonstrated that modern steel warships, manned by professional crews and equipped with rifled artillery, could dominate older vessels regardless of their crew's courage or tactical positioning. European navies began immediate modernization programs, while American shipyards received orders for dozens of new vessels. According to historical analyses published in the Naval War College Review decades later, the battle marked a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. The United States had announced its arrival as a world power in the most dramatic way possible by destroying a European fleet in Asian waters and claiming territory on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. As the sun set over Manila Bay on that historic day, Admiral Dewey could reflect on having achieved something remarkable in the annals of naval warfare. He had not merely won a battle, he had changed the course of history. The Spanish Empire's decline, already evident in Cuba and other colonies, had become irreversible with the loss of the Philippines. Meanwhile, the United States had taken its first steps toward becoming the global superpower it would remain for the next century and beyond. The victory at Manila Bay proved that American industrial might, combined with professional military leadership and modern technology, could challenge and defeat the established powers of the Old World. It was a lesson that would resonate through to world wars and into the modern era, establishing precedents for American intervention and influence that continue to shape international relations today. The Battle of Manila Bay stands as one of the most decisive naval engagements in modern history, marking America's emergence as a global power and the end of Spain's Pacific Empire. The courage and professionalism displayed by both sides, despite the overwhelming American victory, exemplified the honor and tradition of naval service that transcends national boundaries and political considerations.